All right, so we're diving into John 8, 1 to 11, and I know you're looking for some fresh perspectives.
Something beyond those typical Sunday school answers,
Exactly. You want something that really connects, with today's world.
like sermon illustrations that are going to stick with people.
Yeah, and examples of, how other pastors have approached this in unique ways.
That's right. You want to go deeper. You want to uncover those deeper truths
Yeah.
and find those insights that can really spark some change in your congregation.
Exactly. So we dug into a bunch of sermons and commentaries.
Focusing on John 8, 1 to 11, specifically looking for those non-obvious insights.
Right. So what were some of the more creative approaches that you found?
Well, one pastor connected this passage to King David's sin in Psalm 51.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's a really brilliant connection because both stories use the same Hebrew words
Oh,
for
wow.
transgressions, iniquity, and sin.
Okay, so they're using the same language to describe the wrongdoing.
Exactly. And I think that emphasizes the depth of understanding that both David and the woman had about their need for grace.
But David's sin was very different from the woman's, right?
Of course, the situations are different, but they share that common thread of remorse
Okay.
and that desperate need for grace.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In fact, one pastor even suggested a practical exercise.
Oh, what is that?
Encourage your congregation to write down areas where they feel judged
Okay.
and then actively practice offering themselves grace in those areas.
I like that, make it personal,
Yeah, exactly.
actionable.
Put it into practice.
Okay, so that was one approach to grace. Were there any other unique angles?
One pastor used a courtroom analogy, and they said that Jesus becomes both the defense attorney and the judge.
Wow, that's interesting. How do you reconcile those two?
Well, they argued that while Jesus doesn't condone the woman's actions,
Right.
he recognizes her vulnerability and offers grace instead of condemnation. So it's a really powerful image.
Yeah, it is. And speaking of the setting, the temple itself seems really significant.
Oh, absolutely. One pastor pointed out the irony of the temple, a place meant for worship and forgiveness being used for judgment.
Right.
They suggested that Jesus writing in the sand was symbolically revealing the accuser's own sins.
Wow, it really makes you think about the atmosphere we create in our own churches.
Right. Are we building environments of judgment or grace?
It's a big question for us as leaders, isn't it?
It is. And that same pastor encouraged their congregation to kind of do a self-audit.
Okay.
Like, ask yourself, if someone walked into our church for the first time, would they feel welcomed and loved or judged and excluded?
That's a good point. It's not just about talking about grace. It's about, actually living it out.
Embodying it.
Right.
And making sure that our actions and the way we structure our communities reflect that grace.
Yeah, one pastor even said, if people are afraid to confess their struggles in our church, then we've failed to create a space where grace can flourish.
It's powerful.
It is, and I think it's something that a lot of pastors need to hear.
I agree. Another recurring theme was the act of dropping stones.
Oh, yeah, that's a pretty powerful image, the weight of those stones.
Right, the potential for harm.
So how did these pastors use that imagery?
One asked, are we, in our words and actions, throwing stones at others, or are we extending the same grace that Jesus offered? Another pastor went even further and urged their congregation to think about all the subtle ways we throw stones today.
Okay, so not just the obvious ones.
Like through gossip, social media, or even just our unspoken judgments.
Yeah, it's so easy to condemn others without even realizing it.
It is, and it's important to remember that extending grace doesn't mean condoning sin.
Right.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity and offering compassion and understanding instead of judgment.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we avoid throwing those stones?
One pastor had a really simple but powerful suggestion.
Okay, what's that?
Before you criticize someone, ask yourself, would I say this to their face?
Ooh.
And if so, would I say it with love and a genuine desire to help them grow?
That's really good advice, and it applies to all of us, not just, in church.
Absolutely. It's about carrying that grace with us everywhere we go.
So it seems like a lot of these sermons were challenging that kind of black and white thinking.
Yes, several pastors pointed out that the Pharisees were all about rigid interpretations of the law,
Right.
but Jesus introduced this new paradigm of grace that went beyond that.
So what exactly do they mean by a new paradigm of grace?
Well, one pastor explained it as moving away from seeing grace as just forgiveness of sins,
Okay.
and seeing it as this active power that helps us change and grow.
I like that.
They pointed out that Jesus didn't just forgive the woman, he told her to go and sin no more.
Yeah, so it's not just about being let off the hook. It's about being empowered to live a different kind of life.
Exactly. It's about embracing that transformative power of grace.
And that's a tough message, especially in a world that's so quick to judge and categorize people.
It is. It's a challenge for all of us.
So how do we move beyond those rigid interpretations and embrace a more nuanced understanding of grace?
One pastor suggested incorporating stories of people who have experienced radical transformation.
Oh, that's good.
Another pastor recommended using art or music to evoke emotional responses.
Interesting. So go beyond just the intellectual.
Exactly. Engage the heart as well as the mind.
Yeah, those are some really creative approaches.
They are, and it's exciting to see pastors finding new ways to connect with their congregations.
Yeah, and make these ancient stories relevant to modern life.
That's the key, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One pastor used an analogy that I think really captures this whole spirit of innovation.
Okay, I'd love to hear it.
They said the church should be a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is.
It's a call for a redemptive community that balances grace and truth.
Yeah, it highlights the need for the church to be a place of healing and transformation,
Yes,
not a place of judgment and exclusion.
exactly. A place where people feel safe to come as they are.
This has been fascinating, but how do we actually make our churches reflect that ideal? How do we create those spaces where people feel safe to be vulnerable?
Well, that's a question a lot of these pastors wrestled with.
Yeah.
And we'll delve into some of their insights right after this.
So how do we make our churches reflect that ideal?
Yeah, how do we actually create those spaces where people feel safe to be vulnerable?
Right, to confess their struggles and receive the grace and support they need to grow.
Well, one pastor talked about the importance of moving beyond that punitive mindset,
Right.
That's so prevalent in our society today.
Yeah, it's like everything's about punishment, you know?
Right.
Like you made a mistake, so you have to be punished.
Exactly. And they argued that God's kingdom isn't about punishment. It's about redemption and restoration.
Yeah.
And they really emphasized that Jesus's interaction with the woman demonstrates this shift from a punitive to a grace-filled approach.
Interesting. Were there any sermons that explored the cultural and historical context of this passage?
Oh, absolutely. One pastor highlighted the cultural context of the woman's vulnerability, due to her gender and lack of legal rights in that society.
Right, she was really at a disadvantage.
She was, and it helps us understand the power dynamics at play
Yeah.
and the immense courage it took for her to even be in that situation.
And that makes Jesus's actions even more radical, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because he's subverting those norms.
He's offering grace instead of condemnation.
He sees her humanity,
He does.
her worth.
Yes, and he refuses to participate in that system that's trying to dehumanize and marginalize her.
It's a powerful example for us,
Yeah,
though,
yeah.
as followers of Christ,
It is.
to stand up for the marginalized
Yes.
and to challenge those systems of oppression and justice.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that grace isn't just about, individual salvation.
Right.
It's about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It is, so it sounds like the pastors you researched really dove into the cultural and social implications of this passage. Did any of them talk about the authenticity of the story itself?
Yeah.
I know there's some debate about whether it was originally part of John's gospel.
Right. Yeah. One pastor actually addressed that directly. They
Right.
acknowledged the scholarly debate,
Mm-hmm.
but they ultimately chose to treat the passage as an illustration of Jesus's character.
Regardless of its origins.
Exactly. They focused on the message rather than getting bogged down in those historical arguments.
Yeah, sometimes we can get so caught up in the academic side of things that we lose sight of the heart of the message.
Absolutely. And I think for pastors, it's important to remember that their primary audience is their congregation, not, a group of scholars.
Right, that's a good point. So how did these pastors bring the passage to life for their congregations?
Well, many of them used really memorable illustrations.
Okay, like what?
Analogies were really popular because they help people connect with abstract concepts in a tangible way.
Right, I like that.
For example, one pastor used the idea of social media as a modern-day form of throwing stones.
Ooh, that's a good one. So relevant.
It is,
Oh,
right? It's so easy to hide behind our screens
Yeah.
and hurl insults or judgments.
Yeah, without considering the impact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the pastor challenged the congregation to think about how they're using social media. Are they building people up or tearing them down?
That's a powerful question.
Yes.
It really makes you think about the responsibility we have,
Yeah.
especially as Christians.
Yes.
to use our words carefully.
Absolutely, both online and offline.
Another pastor used a more humorous approach.
Oh, okay.
They described the Pharisees as a gang called the Sin Patrol.
Oh, I like that.
I know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were planning this elaborate trap for Jesus.
Like a heist movie.
Yeah, exactly.
That's funny.
It is. And it also highlights the absurdity of their actions,
It does.
and their obsession with catching Jesus in a supposed wrongdoing.
Yeah, were there any that weren't quite so modern?
Yeah, one pastor used the classic analogy of a jar being half full or half empty,
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
right, to challenge that black and white thinking of the Pharisees.
It's simple but effective.
Yeah, and encourages us to consider different viewpoints
Yeah.
and to, avoid making those snap judgments.
Right, there's always more to the story.
Exactly. Were there any other historical insights that stood out to you?
One sermon highlighted the fact that Jewish leaders at the time couldn't execute someone without Roman approval.
Oh, right.
So by demanding that the woman be stoned, they were actually trying to set a trap for Jesus.
Yeah, if he had agreed, he would have been breaking Roman law.
Exactly.
And if he had defied the Mosaic law, he would have been seen as a heretic.
Right. A no-win situation.
Wow, what a difficult position to be in.
It really adds another layer to the story.
Yeah.
And highlights those political tensions.
Yeah, and it makes Jesus' actions even more remarkable because he navigates this dangerous situation with wisdom and grace.
He does.
He refuses to be drawn into their trap
Right.
and instead offers that path of mercy and forgiveness.
Beautiful.
It's amazing how much depth and nuance there is to this story when you really start to unpack it.
It is.
Did any pastors connect John 8:1-11 with other parts of Scripture?
Yes, several of them did.
Okay.
One drew a parallel between this passage and Luke 10:27,
Okay.
where Jesus sums up the law as loving God and your neighbor.
That's a powerful connection.
Yeah.
It reminds us that the heart of the law is about love and compassion.
Exactly, and that Jesus's actions in this passage are the perfect embodiment of that principle.
They also reference Jeremiah 31.34,
Yes.
which speaks of a new covenant where God's law is written on people's hearts,
Yes.
not on stone tablets.
Right. It points to a deeper understanding of the law,
Yeah, one that's not about external rituals or pronouncements.
but about an internal transformation of the heart.
Exactly. And it suggests that Jesus, through his grace and forgiveness, is ushering in this new covenant.
That's right.
This deep dive has already yielded so many incredible insights and sermon illustrations.
It has.
What are your final thoughts on how we can bring these ideas to life in our ministries?
I think one thing that stood out to me was the power of personal stories.
Okay, personal stories. How so?
Several pastors shared their own experiences
Okay.
to make the message more real and relatable for their congregations.
What kind of stories did they share?
Well, one pastor talked about being wrongly punished as a child,
Oh, wow.
and they connected that experience to the woman's vulnerability and the injustice she faced.
Yeah, I bet that resonated with a lot of people.
Did you know anyone who's ever felt unfairly judged or misunderstood?
Right.
And it really helped to illustrate that grace isn't just this theological concept.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person, even when they've made mistakes.
It's about seeing the human being.
Exactly, looking beyond the offense.
Did any other pastors share personal stories?
Yeah, another pastor spoke candidly about their struggle with legalism and how they learned to embrace grace.
Mm.
And they actually compared it to dancing with their daughter at her wedding reception,
Oh,
letting go of inhibitions, and just enjoying the moment.
that's a beautiful image.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, it really captures the joy and freedom that come with letting go of those rigid rules and expectations.
Right. Grace isn't about being perfect.
Yeah.
It's about experiencing the love and acceptance of God just as we are.
I love that. Did any pastors use stories that related more directly to the themes of John 8:1-11?
Yes, one pastor used the story of a 13-year-old girl receiving a heart transplant
Wow.
to illustrate the transformative power of receiving a new heart from Jesus.
That's a powerful analogy.
It is. It emphasizes the gratitude and new life that come with spiritual transformation.
We all need that heart transplant.
We do. We need God's grace to change us from the inside out.
It's a good reminder that we're all in need of that same grace,
Yes,
regardless of our outward actions.
absolutely. Another pastor used a more unexpected story.
Oh, okay. What was that?
They talked about their time as a Walmart greeter,
A Walmart greeter.
dealing with difficult customers.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How did they connect that to John 8:1-11?
Well, they used it to illustrate the theme of self-preservation
Okay.
and how our society is so focused on punishment rather than redemption.
Hmm.
Even in those seemingly mundane situations, we have opportunities to choose grace over judgment.
That's a good point. It's not just for Sunday mornings.
Right. It's for every day.
Yeah, these principles are meant to shape our everyday lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those John 8, 1 to 11 moments in our daily interactions
Yeah.
and responding with compassion and understanding.
It sounds like these pastors really took seriously the challenge of making this ancient story relevant. What an incredible collection of insights and approaches.
It's been a fascinating deep dive.
It has. We've explored everything from historical context to personal stories.
Challenging analogies, practical applications.
It just goes to show the depth and richness of this passage.
There's always more to discover.
So what does this all mean for our listener as they prepare their own sermons or Bible studies?
Don't be afraid to go dig beneath the surface.
Yeah, explore those nuances.
Challenge yourself and your audience to think critically and creatively about this story.
Don't settle for easy answers.
Embrace the mystery and complexity.
Allow it to challenge your assumptions
Expand your understanding of grace.
and inspire you to create a more compassionate and redemptive community.
What if Jesus wasn't just writing in the sand that day?
What if he was also writing a new story? A story of grace and redemption for the woman, for the accusers, and for us.
And what role will you play in continuing that story?